All right, so we are on the very last chapter of Thomas Pynchon's great novel V, which is an epilogue that, in a sense, pulls a number of threads together. The previous chapter had let a bunch of things be suspended in a realm of perpetual ambiguity. But for those who prefer strings tied, Pynchon sort of adds this wonderful epilogue that I think is very fast. It's almost like, once again, like a miniature novel into itself. Let's see, it's very long. And it begins, I can find the beginning. Okay. And it's set on Malta once again, but this time in 1919, as the war is winding down and Malta is struggling for independence from Italy. And so it's worth recounting the timeline of V's appearances as they would be chronologically. Pynchon has not given her appearances in chronological format. As we know, he scrambled the timeline a bit. But if we review it, it's worth keeping track of. She was born in England in 1880. So now in 1898, the first time we saw her was in Cairo as Victoria Wren, where she was a young girl in Cairo. And her only connection at that point with the inanimate was the fact that her younger sister Mildred, the 11-year-old girl, was a rock collector. We never see Mildred again. Then in 1899, the following year, her name appears as Victoria Wren, once again in Florence, in the plot to steal Botticelli's Birth of Venus from the Uffizi. So she appears there. Then chronologically would be 1913, V in Love in Paris, the scene that we have just seen where she was in love with the ballet dancer Melanie. And her connection with the inanimate there is the fact that she treats Melanie like a fetish, not like a person, but a sex object, basically almost like a mannequin who just masturbates for her, and she surrounds her with mirrors. So you can sort of trace her fall, sinking, and capture. It's like the Gnostic myth of the fall of the Anthropos, the being of light, who falls into Phusis. Nous, or mind, falls into Phusis, as the Gnostic myth goes, and becomes captured there, which is a very late echo in the Narcissus myth when he's looking over into a pool and he falls in. That's what the myth is. It's the descent of spirit into matter. But here it's the descent of the muse of Western civilization into the inanimate. So then her next appearance would be chronologically here in 1919, as we'll see, where she appears as Veronica Manganese in Malta again. And by this point, as we'll see, she has the clock eye and also the sapphire that's sewn into her navel. And then at one point she's fantasizing and she's talking to Sidney Stencil. They're not having an affair. She's much older by this point, almost 40. Sidney Stencil isn't really interested. This is Herbert's father now. So we're a generation back with these characters, as we'll see. She starts fantasizing about how she wishes her feet were like her shoes and that they were beautiful and made out of other metals, beautiful metals and jewels, and she wishes she could detach them just like feet. So she's already fantasizing at that point about replacing her feet. Then, of course, in 1922, where she appears in German Southwest Africa as Vera Meroving, which was the first time we saw the clock eye, but it's not the first time chronologically that she had it. This fills in, the epilogue fills in that gap. And then would be her death, the last appearance in 1943 as the bad priest on Malta, who is disassembled, as we have seen, with Paolo Maestro contributing in that disassembly as a child and stealing the ivory comb from her hair. But if we went all the way down to 1956 with Stencil's fantasy of her, as we saw in the chapter V in Love, where he's telling it, he stops and fantasizes about what the 76-year-old V would be like at this point. She would be this electronic goddess with diodes and cathodes and all sorts of electronic things powering her. And in that sense, she would be the electronic bride displacing McLuhan's mechanical bride. Western civilization has moved in various technical phases. If we wanted to invoke Lewis Mumford's Technics and Civilization, where he divides the history of technical civilization in the West with the Paleotechnic, which is powered by wind, water, and wood, sailing ships, and everything is being moved by the natural elements, especially wind, to then, or not the Eotechnic, rather the Dawn Technic, to the Paleotechnic, when iron starts coming in. Things are ornamented with iron. Things get moving with the Industrial Revolution and steam. And then to the Neotechnic, where electricity starts coming in at the end of the 19th century and lighting this thing up and powering it. So the muse transforms from a mechanical bride to an electronic bride. And that would be the full descent of V as a kind of noose figure into the inanimate, the exoskeletal shell that she wears, and the invasion of the inanimate across the street, and the fleeing of humanity down, like this guy behind me here, over here, who is fleeing from the firebombing of the German cities. The world above has been invaded by the inanimate there, and now this is us in Pynchon's novel here, reduced to these creatures that are just fleeing into subterranean realms down below, which is the only place left to go to escape the invasion of the inanimate. So that's the timeline. And then so the epilogue opens up then with Sidney Stencil now, Herbert's father, pulling into the harbor on a ship, a sailing ship, with a good old-fashioned captain named Mehmet, who's a Muslim, who's kind of a figure out of a Sinbad story or something. And they're pulling into the harbor, and the figurehead that they have is of the goddess Astarte, which is Ishtar. That's a transformation of Ishtar, Babylonian Ishtar, which in turn is a transformation of Sumerian Inanna, the goddess of erotic sex and love, who eventually becomes Greek Aphrodite. So that's guiding their ship. And then Mehmet tells him this legend about the presiding soul of Malta is a woman. It is Mara. And Mara is Maltese for woman. And he says, well, Mara is actually, there's a legend about Mara that you should know, that took place during the Great Siege of Malta when the Turks were trying to conquer Malta in 1565. They were trying to claim it. And what happened was they took Mara prisoner, they captured her, and as they were bringing her back to the Sultan, to Constantinople on the ship, she went into a kind of blind trance, and no one could awake her from it. No one could rouse her. So what they did was they tied her as a human living figurehead to the prow, and as it's coming into the harbor, she's a living figurehead, although she's not making any sound. However, once the Sultan takes her in as a concubine in his harem, in the seraglio, she comes alive for him and with him, but then she slowly sort of poisons his harem. She teaches the women in the harem how to masturbate. She teaches the eunuchs how to have sex by some magical means. I would presume that they've been castrated, but by some magical means, their phalluses are restored. And so now everyone's having sex. And so they're escaping the overcoating of the Sultan's sign regime with all these lines of flight that he can't overcome. This is classic D&G with their sign regime of the Byzantine despot ruler who is constantly paranoid and wanting to overcode all the signifiers and prevent them from escaping his apparatus of capture as his gaze. But they're escaping, and she's putting a spell on everyone, so this is upsetting him. And meanwhile, the Turks, led by this guy named Mustafa, are conquering the island, but all at once, for some mysterious reason, even though they're winning, they decide to retreat. And the rumor is that he has heard simply that the king of Toledo is coming in. He's coming in from Sicily with a larger army than he has. The rumor is that he has 20,000 men, but he only has 1,200. And this scares the guy away, so the Turks mysteriously withdraw. But he said, actually, what this guy Mehmet, who's telling Sidney Stencil the story, he says, actually what happened, though, is that the head of the Sultan was detached by Mara, who was a witch goddess, and it was sent floating through the Mediterranean, like the head of Orpheus, floating through the Mediterranean, and it went and it whispered into the ear of Mustafa to leave the island, let it go. And so it scared him, and then he left. And then the head went back and returned to the Sultan, while meanwhile Mara disguised herself as a cabin boy and got on board a ship that went back to Valletta. So this is the legend, as Mehmet tells it. I don't know if Pynchon made this up or if it's based on a true myth, that Mara is the essence and soul of Malta, and she cannot be conquered. She is the goddess. Malta is the goddess. And it goes all the way back to the goddess worship on that island in the Neolithic. So then the story progresses, and what happens is that Stencil realizes that Veronica Wren is here. Her name is Veronica Manganese. She's a sort of peripheral figure now he's a spy working for the British government, and she is a spy working for Mussolini. And Italy is trying to claim the island, so there's a struggle for independence on the part of the Maltese people. And he suspects she's a spy. And then there's also Father Faring now, who appears in this generation. Remember, he's the one who was fucking the rats under the sewer in profanes mine. So it's probably not true. He's probably got information garbled there, and he's just having a fantasy. But nonetheless, so Father Fearing is here, and Fearing is working as a spy on Sidney Stencil's behalf. And he also meets Evan Godolphin, the guy who we had last seen, whose plane had crashed and was the idol of Schoenmaker, the plastic surgeon. He now appears, and remember that Schoenmaker became a plastic surgeon because he objected to the horrible invasion of Evan Godolphin's face by the inanimates. And it's still horribly disfigured with bits of metal hanging out like some character out of a Star Wars film. So there's Evan Godolphin as V's caretaker, Veronica Manganese. And Sidney Stencil identifies him. He had known Hugh Godolphin, the father, and remember Hugh Godolphin will appear again in V's life in German Southwest Africa in 1922. But here's Evan Godolphin trailing around behind her. So Sidney Stencil is not sure what to make of this situation. And then we also meet Fausto Maestral's parents, Carla Maestral, and we don't know the name of his father. He's just referred to as Maestral, but he's a shipbuilder. And he's also working as a spy on behalf of Sidney Stencil. So he's got both Fausto Maestral's father and Father Fearing working as a spy on his behalf, possibly against Veronica Manganese. And then eventually what happens is that he realizes Carla Maestral comes to him and says that she suspects that her husband is having an affair with Veronica Manganese. And it turns out to be true. They are actually having an affair, and it's spoiling the political situation. Father Fearing now has been called away to America. So Sidney Stencil is losing his spies. He loses Father Fearing, who is now sent to America, so he has to leave, which upsets the situation. And then, so Carla is threatening that she will kill herself if she doesn't get her husband back. She will kill herself and the child that she's pregnant with, namely Fausto Maestral, if she doesn't get her husband back. So Sidney realizes that he has to convince the husband to let go of the affair, and during the last couple of pages of the novel, he does. He goes to Veronica Manganese, and he separates the guy out, talks to him, and says, you have to go back to your wife. You cannot have this affair with Veronica Manganese. It's going to spoil the troubles. What will happen with the June disturbances on June 7th, 1919? There are riots. And then so there's also this opposition now, really the last opposition of the novel that Pynchon is fond of. Pynchon is a literary deconstructionist. He's the equivalent in many ways of Derrida. What he does is, we have seen him do all along, is to take a metaphysical bivalent opposition between an antinomy and then deconstruct it with a third term, as we have seen with McClintock's Sphere deconstructing his flip-flop dichotomy with keep cool but care. That becomes the third term that upsets the dichotomy and causes it to collapse, exactly as Derrida does when he deconstructs metaphysical bivalent ontologies and delegitimizes their absolute opposition, in which the problem with those oppositions is that one term, like say man versus woman, is always privileged over the other. And Derrida's deconstruction is a manner of getting in there and pulling out that which holds that opposition and generates it so that it deconstructs and falls apart. So the opposition here is right and left, the political right and the political left, which Pynchon characterizes as the hothouse versus the street. The hothouse is always the right. It is the realm of ideas that are stuck with the past and in the past, such as the church. It is in the past and is beholden to the past and conserves the past as a kind of hothouse. But in opposition to that is the left, which is the street, where mob violence is constantly being incited. Mobs on the left are always being incited to riot and attack the hothouse and get rid of it. So we have this opposition between hothouse and street here, which V then will disrupt. Even though it appears that she's on the side of fascism, nonetheless, she represents a third term that disrupts the opposition and causes it to collapse. So this is the antinomy that is set up. And he does this, Pynchon does this by evoking Joachim of Fiore's model. He's a 12th century monk who has the model of the three stages of the evolution of history, moving from Father to Son to the Holy Spirit, or the Paraclete. The age of the Father is, of course, the Old Testament for Joachim, and the age of the Son is, of course, the New Testament and the Church. The Hebrews are displaced by the Church in the second phase, and then the third phase is the descent of the Holy Spirit, in which the Church will fall away and the Holy Spirit will speak to the individual directly, favoring the monk, the wandering monk, detached from the Church, the nomad, in opposition to the church itself and its hierarchical structure. So that's Joachim's model, but here it becomes mapped onto a kind of political model where we have the father aligned with the hothouse, the realm of the church, and the street as the son with the left, and the disruptions that mob violence brings in, and then the possible coming of a paraclete. And here you can already see that this chapter is pregnant with the next novel that Pynchon writes, The Crying of Lot 49, which is about the descent of the tongues of flame in the Acts, Luke's, the second half of the Gospel of Luke, which is the Acts of the Apostles, in which the tongues of flame of the Paraclete descend to the apostles and confer on them all the different languages that will be necessary to speak to all the different ethnicities to convert them all to Christianity. And it takes place 49 days after the death of Christ. And so that's the next novel. But here Pynchon's already talking about what he calls Paracletian politics. The Paraclete actually appears for the first time in the John Gospel as the Comforter. Christ says, he will come after me as the Paraclete, and he will comfort you. So there's been a lot of discussion about what the hell the Paraclete means all through ecclesiastical history. And so the Paraclete is supposed to come and disrupt this binomial opposition between father and son, between right and left, between hothouse and the street, and the Paraclete will come and scramble that and basically deconstruct it. And so that's essentially what's going on with this epilogue. It's already pregnant with the theme of the Paraclete in The Crying of Lot 49, which we'll get to next. And it ties up a lot of the novel's loose ends, all these characters coming together, where Pynchon gives you, if you want a meta-narrative and if you want a solid way of connecting the dots, he offers that to you just as well as he offers contrary evidence of rumor and uncertainties that mess up Stencil's ability to create a grand meta-narrative out of V. So Pynchon leaves it up to you, the reader, to decide how much of this is real and how much of this has been made up by Stencil. The epilogue is a little funny because it occurs outside of the novel in a way because it has nothing to do with Stencil. It's not a narrative of Herbert Stencil's creation, as all the other V accounts are. It's an authorial intrusion almost, a third-person omniscient authorial intrusion where he adds, oh, by the way, here's this story of Herbert's father and Fausto Maestral's parents and the generation before them and what happened with them. So that's it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is How You Write a Novel. That's a damn good book. There's a lot in there to chew on. So we'll move on next to The Crying of Lot 49 and then to Gravity's Rainbow.